very good afternoon, everyone. Emerald Professor Janet Columbagate, Her Excellency Shashikala Prema Vardhane, Professor C. Raja Mohan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roshni, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS NUS, I welcome you to this afternoon's ISAS book launch and panel discussion titled, Role of Small States in Emerging Maritime Affairs. To begin, I would like to invite Emerald Professor Janet Columbagate, Foreign Secretary, Sri Lanka, to deliver the keynote address. He'll be addressing us via Zoom. Emerald, please.
Again, I'm happy to be with you on this very important time to talk about a book compiled about Sri Lanka's and the maritime space. Ladies and gentlemen, I would describe this region as a region of strategic competition, strategic convergence, and strategic dilemma. Now, in that, I am going to talk to you about the third category, not about the strategic competition or the strategic convergence, but about the countries like Sri Lanka in the third category, which is the strategic dilemma. Why do I use the word strategic dilemma? Because most of the countries, especially in the Indian Ocean, are not in the first two categories of strategic competition and convergence. Like Sri Lanka, we are in the third category. Now, let me talk about the Indian Ocean and some emerging trends. Everybody knows about the Indian Ocean. Everybody knows about the Indian Ocean trade. So I'm not going to talk about the Indian Ocean trade or the geostrategic, geoeconomic importance of the Indian Ocean. But let me briefly mention three new trends that we witnessed by being in the central location of the Indian Ocean. Number one, we see huge politicization of the maritime trade. Number two, we see huge politicization of maritime related infrastructure in the region. Number three, of course, increased militarization of the Indian Ocean region. So these are the three new trends that we witnessed by being in Sri Lanka: increased politicization of the maritime trade, increased politicization of the maritime related infrastructure, and increased militarization of the Indian Ocean region. We all know that the global politics have now shifted to the ocean, and in that, the Indian Ocean region is taking a key position. And we also know that the COVID-19 has induced so many new things, so many restrictions, so many disruptions to global supply chain. But still, the maritime trade is bound to bounce back. Maritime trade is bound to bounce back, and the importance of the ocean is not going to diminish. It is only going to increase. Now, if you look at the states coming in the third category, that is the strategic dilemma, what do we really need in this era of 21st century? What we need is to combat COVID. I would put that as the top priority for many nations in this region, to combat COVID. And number two, economic revival. And number three, we need to develop especially maritime related quality infrastructure. And then we need peace and stability in this region in order to derive the benefits from the maritime domain, maritime trade, and maritime resources. If we don't have peace and stability in the region, if we don't have peace and stability in our individual countries, we are going to suffer. And also, especially from a country like Sri Lanka, we need harmony among the people of this country in order to have that peace and stability that I mentioned about. And finally, but the most important point, that I would say many countries in the Indian Ocean region, especially the smaller, less militarily, economically powerful in the Indian Ocean region wants to maintain strategic autonomy. We don't want to bandwagon with one group or the other. We don't want to hedge one power against the other. We don't want to choose one country or one side against the other. What we need is strategic autonomy, but then it is increasingly being challenged. Now, let me also share with you what do we really want in the Indian Ocean when we are talking about the maritime domain. We need two things. Number one, internationally rules-based maritime order. International rules-based maritime order, we are very interested. But having an international rules-based maritime order is not sufficient unless we have enhanced maritime trade, unless we are linked to the increased global maritime supply network or global maritime supply chain. So unless we are able to balance these two, that is the international rules-based maritime order and enhance maritime connectivity and enhance maritime trade, this region is going to be like this for the next decade or so. And also, very importantly, another critical factor when we talk about small countries is we want the big guys to prevent maritime pollution. We are supposed to be dumping 8 million metric tons of plastic every year into the ocean. We know there is a 60,000 square kilometer dead zone in the Bay of Bengal. We know there is a huge garbage patch in the southern Indian Ocean. All this argue for the detrimental effect on the Indian Ocean. Very soon, we will have more plastic in the ocean than the fish. And that will impact, of course, global warming, climate change, large-scale human migration, and the economy of these countries. So big countries per capita pollute more. So we request the big countries, especially, and of course, everyone has a responsibility not to pollute the ocean, to take precautions. Otherwise, the most important fisheries resources, most important tourist resources, we will lose. And also, in the Indian Ocean, there is a huge threat from organized transnational crime. Organized transnational criminal syndicates like illegal narcotics, IUU fishing, human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapon trafficking. It is taking place in the Indian Ocean. And again, the major powers are also required to curb these menace because it is being used by these traffickers to the bigger countries as well. So we want to not to blame each other, but to take action. And I think we need the leadership coming from the major nations in the Indian Ocean region to maintain peace and stability, prevent pollution, and preventing of maritime crime. Now, another thing we see is that, human right is used and abused to surrender a country like Sri Lanka by powerful nations. This is wrong. Now, we know that we don't want to be caught in the power game. We want to be neutral. But I think this is now not what many countries want us to be. Many countries want us to be part of their alliance. Now, that is the problem. Now, if you ask me about a year ago, what do I think of Quad? I would say Quad is a four-pillar countries, and it doesn't mind about other countries. They are doing an alliance in order to maintain peace and order. But if you ask me the question today, I would say the Quad seems to be now indirectly and directly interfering, trying to interfere into the internal domestic matters of countries using human rights and threats and intimidation as a tool. So this, I think, is not healthy. So I have reached 10 minutes. So what we now need is to show solidarity in the Indian Ocean region. What we now need is an Indian Ocean originated strategy. What we now need is rules-based, international rules-based maritime order and enhance maritime trade and prevent pollution and prevent maritime crime. Every member in this region has a responsibility, but the bigger responsibility lies with the larger, powerful countries. So I appeal to the big countries to think of the smaller states in your strategies, in your policies, and then we can have a peaceful Indian Ocean region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Admiral, for your keynote address. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Chulani Atanaika, visiting research fellow ISAS NUS, to give an introduction to the publication Maritime Sri Lanka, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. Dr. Atanaika, please.
Thank you, Roshni. Admiral Professor Jayannath Kolabage, Foreign Secretary, Sri Lanka. Her Excellency Shashikala Premavaratana, Sri Lankan High Commissioner to Singapore, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Good afternoon. On behalf of Institute of South Asian Studies, let me welcome you to the book launch of Maritime Sri Lanka, Historical and Contemporary Perspective. This book has its origin in a workshop we organized in 2018 titled Maritime Sri Lanka, Reclaiming Indian Ocean Identity. It was organized to understand Sri Lanka's newfound interest in reclaiming maritime identity after years and to explain how it articulates this new identity. Those who are not familiar with Sri Lanka's recent maritime story may ask why Sri Lanka need to reclaim a maritime identity when it is an inherent part of the island nation. Yes, I agree with you. Being an island nation, the ocean has always been a part of Sri Lanka. The island is situated right at the center of the world's busiest sea lane of communication. Its geography connects the country with the Indian Ocean, and its destiny is very much linked with the strategic body of water. Sri Lanka's maritime claim is more than its land territory. Undoubtedly, the Indian Ocean offers Sri Lanka the potential for large-scale employment creation, wealth generation, foreign exchange, and trade. However, the Indian Ocean's role in Sri Lanka's strategic, security, and political narrative has changed from time to time. Moreover, Sri Lanka's general understanding of its ocean riches is comparatively low compared to its significance. Immediately after the independence in 1948, Sri Lanka took leadership in the Indian Ocean affairs. Yet over the years, the country's involvement in the Indian Ocean affairs has diluted due to domestic and other regional circumstances. For the past decade or so, Sri Lanka has returned to emphasizing its maritime identity, giving primary focus to the Indian Ocean and its role in the country's social, economic, and developmental activities. Successive governments have made several policy decisions to make the ocean the center of the island's development. For instance, soon after the end of the war, the government adopted a policy to make Sri Lanka an air and naval hub in the region by utilizing its strategic location. In 2019, following the UN Law of the Sea entitlement, Sri Lanka made a submission to expand its exclusive economic zone, which would permit the island to own an EEZ equivalent to 23 times of its landmass. Of course, India, Bangladesh, and Maldives objected the initial submission, yet Colombo is negotiating for reconsideration. Following the adoption of the concept of the blue economy, the Sri Lankan government admitted the overriding factor of the Indian Ocean riches in its economic transformation. It emphasized the dependence on the sea for development. It initiated the Indian Ocean Conference and the Galle Dialogue to develop its profile as an Indian Ocean state. In 2017, then Prime Minister and Foreign Minister used the exact words, reclaiming the maritime identity. Despite all these developments, the broad understanding of Sri Lanka's Indian Ocean identity are yet to be explored. Therefore, discussions are needed to understand what does reclamation means, how is Sri Lanka going to do it, how Sri Lanka will position itself in the growing geopolitical changes. So, this book was an humble attempt to contribute to this discourse. Maritime Sri Lanka book has 15 essays covering multiple aspects and issues related to Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean. They are written by renowned academics, policymakers, and practitioners. It covers historical and contemporary perspective on Sri Lanka's awareness and understanding of this body of water. It analyzes and looks at viewpoints on its economic, security, and geopolitical relationship with the Indian Ocean. Chapters are presented thematically in 3 sections: history and contemporary perspectives, economy, security, and geopolitics, and finally, external perspectives. Essays in the first 2 sections are contributed by Sri Lankan academics, policymakers, and practitioners, whereas the third section consists of international contributors' viewpoints. Let me take a moment to give a brief glimpse into the content. The section on historical and contemporary perspective covers some interesting viewpoints on Sri Lanka as a maritime nation. Some of it unearths aspects that are not discussed often. When discussing Sri Lanka's maritime history, the most academic discourses focus on its role as a transit center during the Silk Road, or how 3 colonial powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, strategically utilized Sri Lanka's location. One of the lesser known factors is how the French fought a war with the British, not just once but twice, due to Sri Lanka's strategic geographical location. So you can read more about this information in the book. It's called The Battle of Trincomalee. Apart from that, the book has some interesting viewpoints on how the Indian Ocean has evolved as a strategic place in Sri Lanka's foreign policy since independence, and how the 21st century Sri Lanka is accepting the Indian Ocean as its major immediate environment. The chapters explain how the island nation can utilize the Indian Ocean ecosystem for better political engagement with the world. It suggests that the country has the capacity and capability to reach out, to engage, to represent, to persuade, and even to influence the international community through oceanic environment. This is an innovative viewpoint, as Sri Lanka's engagement with the outside world often goes through numerous ups and downs for a period of time now. One of the chapters also evaluates Sri Lanka's idea of reclaiming a maritime identity. Here, the author explains how Sri Lanka has never had a well-articulated idea of Sri Lanka, and how this is posing challenges in this new identity. Economy, security, and geopolitical section has 2 chapters on the economy, 1 chapter on maritime security, and 2 chapters on geopolitics. The chapters on the economy look at the maritime trade, particularly container traffic, and how it has changed since the financial crisis. The chapter analyzes the macroeconomic outlook of the Indian Ocean economy and policy implications for Sri Lanka. They also explore recent trends in economic growth and reforms in the country, and affirms that Sri Lanka has a great potential in the region. The chapters on security and geopolitics observe maritime security issues in the Indian Ocean region and their impact on Sri Lanka's national security. They explore how developments bring both opportunities and challenges for Sri Lanka, and how the power struggle in the Indian Ocean and changing geopolitics is affecting the island. They also explain how Sri Lanka can use multiple strategies to leverage the power struggle to its advantage without getting absorbed into the conflict. The final section, external perspective, consists of 6 chapters, bringing perspective from international scholars on how they see Sri Lanka's relationship with the Indian Ocean and how their respective countries view it. There are chapters from the viewpoints of United States, China, Japan, India, and Australia. It also has a very interesting chapter on Seychelles and Mauritius and what Sri Lanka can learn from these two maritime states. Overall, the book gives a broad understanding on how Sri Lanka is looking at the Indian Ocean in this century. It reviews the opportunities and challenges offered by recent development in the Indian Ocean region and measures Sri Lanka should be taking to leverage the situation. So I believe Maritime Sri Lanka, this book, will be a beginning of extensive in-depth research into Sri Lanka's role in the 21st century maritime affairs. I also believe this will be a value addition to the discourse on small states in maritime context. I can promise you that each and every chapter provides well-thought analytical insight. So I hope you will enjoy reading this book. Before I wind up, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who have been a pillar in completing this project. Let me thank once again Sri Lankan High Commissioner to Singapore and her team for coming here today to grace this event. I'm grateful for taking time to come here amidst your busy schedule. I'm heartily thankful to the Board of Institute of South Asian Studies NUS. I especially thank Professor Raja Mohan, Director of our institute, for his continuous guidance, feedback, and advice on this project. I'm deeply indebted to contributors for the commitment and patience, some of whom are joining me virtually today. Thank you once again for agreeing to be a part of this project without any reservations and for trusting me as your editor. Venkatesh, Sandhya, Anand, Shreya Gopi, and the team from World Scientific, thank you for your support in editing and production. My dearest friend Shanika, research analyst and interns at ISAS, Roshni, Nishant, Shristi, thank you for your assistance in proofreading and indexing. So I know sometimes you have to work on tight schedules, but thank you for doing it for me. And Trisha, for the beautiful cover, you managed to transform what I had in beautifully. Harnik, Sitara, Jordan, Yusuf, Nitya, and everyone from the admin team, thank you for all the effort you put for this to put this event together. Thank you all my colleagues and friends and also my loving family for the support and for believing in me. It keeps me going and make me work hard. Thank you. Lastly, let me thank all of you who joined me today physically and virtually for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adenayake. Maybe I'll request you to kindly remain on stage. To launch the book, I would like to invite on stage Her Excellency Shashikala Premawardene, High Commissioner of Sri Lanka to Singapore, and Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, ISAS NUS. Her Excellency Premawardene and Dr. Adenayake will unveil and signify the launch of the book. Thank you, Her Excellency. I would like to invite Professor Mohan and Dr. Adenayake to take their seats on stage. I would also like to invite our other panelists on stage, Mr. John Bradford. Mr. Bradford, please. We will now start the panel discussion titled Role of Small States in Emerging Maritime Affairs. I would like to introduce the following distinguished panelists who are going to join us via Zoom to be part of this discussion. Dr. Ganesh Vignaraja, Senior Visiting Fellow Pathfinder Foundation, Sri Lanka, and Non-Resident Senior Fellow, ISAS, NUS. Dr. David Brewster, Senior Research Fellow, National Security College, Australian National University, Canberra. And with us today on stage, we have Mr. John Bradford, Senior Fellow, Maritime Security Program, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU, Dr. Chulni Atanaike, Visiting Research Fellow, ISAS, NUS, and Editor of Maritime Sri Lanka, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. The session will be chaired by Professor Mohan, Director, ISAS, NUS. For the participants who are watching via the live stream, you may direct any comments or questions for the panelists via the comment box. We will consolidate questions for any discussion. I will hand the floor to Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Roshan. I just want to begin by thanking Ambassador Columbage for taking time off to note address for the launch of this book. I also want to thank Her Excellency High Commissioner for launch this book. Of course, congratulations for Chulani for getting this project through. So we have about 40 minutes to discuss the issues raised in the book. But before I ask the three panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, then Chulani will also respond to some of the questions. I just wanted to just make 3 points at the outset. One, I want to affirm that Institute of South Asian Studies is often mistaken for Institute for Indian Studies because our focus is so much on India because India is the largest part of South Asia. But we've taken a conscious decision and conscious effort in recent years to focus on the so-called smaller states. Of course, not all states are small. Even Sri Lanka, I doubt it's very small. Bangladesh is very big. So we're making quite a bit of an effort in the last few years to focus on countries other than India, because my belief is that every one of the South Asian countries, each in its own unique way, has acquired a strategic significance given the larger situation in the world. One of them has an identity that goes beyond South Asian identity. We've talked today about Sri Lanka's maritime identity, Sri Lanka's Indian Ocean identity. Similarly, all countries in South Asia have an identity that goes beyond South Asia. So we want to capture as much as that larger dynamic at play and focusing on the smaller states, which have each one of which, as I said, has a significance of its own. We've recently published a book on Bangladesh, published an important paper on Pakistan recently. We have done one on the series of peacekeeping, which South Asian countries have been very good at it. We've done on Bangladesh. We're planning to do one on Nepal. Hopefully, we'll do one on Pakistan as well. So this is our commitment to do more on the other countries, each one of which is going to be important for Singapore and for the broader world. Second, I think the book is really about Sri Lanka, which given, as was said in the other comments before, has historically been at the center of the movement of goods and people across the Indian Ocean. And today, it is recapturing some of that centrality as the oceans become important, as the great power contestation returns to the maritime domain. That in the old colonial era, I think the early colonial era, much of the decisions and outcomes on the maritime domain decided it. But over the last 70 odd years, the focus has largely been on land wars. And today, last 30 years, the focus was on insurgencies and terrorism. But today, the maritime domain and the great power conflict has returned to the center stage. And in this, I believe, not just Sri Lanka, but every little island, whether it's a country or not, every speck of an island, some are not even islands, if you see what's going on in South China Sea. Some of them are not countries, like Taiwan. So you can see Mauritius, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Cocos, every piece of land that is in the so-called Indo-Pacific is going to be contested, is going to be jockeyed around by the major powers. So we're going to see a dramatic expansion of the focus on small states, especially of the island states. And I think hopefully this is just the beginning of the work that ISAS we are doing. We hopefully will do. And finally, this is I think the focus on maritime domain, I think for us is going to be an important one, thanks to the new debates on the Indo-Pacific and the merging of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, which is going to produce new ways of looking at this region. And in many ways, it's also not entirely new. If you go back to the Second World War, the so-called Southeast Asia Command was located in Sri Lanka. People have forget that. I mean, South Asia and East Asia were not separate, but today they're coming back together. So I think for the Institute of South Asian Studies, located in Singapore, we have a lot of work to do of making East Asia understand South Asia, and of South Asia to see what the dynamics in East Asia are. We hope this is just the beginning of the process, and we look forward to doing more on this front. With those introductory words, I mean, I just want to hand over the floor to Dr. Ganesh Vignarajak. He's delighted he's joined us today. He's part of our team. He's a non-resident fellow. Thank you, Ganesh. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and look forward to your presentation for 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
I'd like to congratulate Chulani on putting together this wonderfully edited book. Today, I shall go beyond my chapter in this book, and I shall use the lens of international macroeconomics to look at four things rather briefly. The first, the historic role of maritime trade in the global economy. Second, and more important, the recovery from the COVID pandemic of maritime trade. Third, the potential of small states in this maritime trade recovery. And last, some policy implications. So on the first point, maritime trade obviously is a critical part of the global economy, and scholars have looked at it in at least two different ways. One is this blue economy, which is an interesting topic, but there are some data issues of how do you measure that. I prefer to use the lens of maritime transport as a way of dissecting this maritime economy. And when you do it this way, over 50 years, you see exponential changes in international trade, in seaborne trade, in technology, and these interrelationships have really changed the way we may think about it. And the game changer really is about container ships, where cargo is carried in truck-sized containers, and you had the introduction of mega ships and automation, as well as alternative fuel and the development of world-class ports. Now, this industry is also heavily globalized with transnational presence. If you look at the numbers before COVID, there were some 50,000 merchant ships employing 1 million seafarers from all nationalities. I think 150 countries are involved if you take this as home to some of these ships. And maritime transport through container traffic grew at some 12% a year in the heyday to reach some 516 million TEUs, which is the measurement they do before the global financial crisis. Much of this is in East Asia and the Pacific, and global trade was powered by all of this. The second point is really about the pandemic. Now, the pandemic brought a crisis like no other to the maritime domain globally. And we have at least an estimate that I've tried to make of an 8% fall in global container traffic due to the pandemic in 2020. This is an estimate. And the big fall is in East Asia and the Pacific, of course. And there were notable falls in North America and Europe. And developing countries and small states also had a big hit. Now, the good news is we are probably seeing an upturn this year, and it could uptick, according to my estimate, to 5.3%. This is global maritime traffic measured by the volume of traffic. And this could actually translate into growth globally of some 5.5%, according to the IMF's number that they are thinking about, up from minus 3.5% last year of global growth. Now, there's a cautionary tale to all of this recovery. When you compare what happened with COVID with the global financial crisis, you have the point that this recovery was not sustained. You have this kind of bumpy pattern that has been ever since the global financial crisis. And in the post-COVID world also, I think we must be a little cautious about this extra optimism about maritime trade. There are many, many risks that are on the horizon. There are very high debt levels of the container ships, which have stories of insolvency for the shipping industry. Another one is these heightened trade and technology tensions between the US and China. And then we have these geopolitical issues, which I'm sure many will talk about, and cybersecurity. So we might end up with a kind of a bathtub-shaped U maritime recovery rather than a V or even an L. So that's the caution that I take away. The third point is about small states. Now, these have really the potential to be flexible players in global maritime trade. And there are many different definitions, Professor, as you alluded to. The Commonwealth has a very pragmatic definition based on population of a small state as being something like less than 1.5 million people. And they also have some other countries which are not so small, but have characteristics of small states, things like Botswana, Papua New Guinea, and so on. A recent study I did for the Commonwealth shows that of the 31 small states measured in this way, 27 are port states. In the Pacific, in Europe, and the Caribbean are there. Some small states have been quite successful in maritime trade. Malta ranked 52nd on the Lloyd's list of 100 best ports, and Jamaica ranked 91st, are famous amongst the world's top 100 container ports. And this is partly explained by a strategic location. Malta is near Europe, an important hub there. We have Jamaica, which is very much in the Caribbean near the US market. And also these countries have attracted foreign investment and have built port capacity as well as efficiency. Coming to Sri Lanka, which is the theme of the book, it's not technically a small state in this Commonwealth definition, but for sure it's a small open economy in the sense it doesn't influence world prices. And Colombo Port, raison d'etre, and Colombo Port is on the Lloyd's list, I think it was 28th or something like that, if I've got my number right, became a very important transshipment port, particularly for the Indian market. Some 2/3 of Sri Lanka's port trade is with India, and a strategic location, obviously, which people talked about earlier, with major investments to handle containerized cargo have been very important, and also deepening the main channel. Now, the crown jewel is this CICT, Colombo International Container Terminal, which has been in operation since 2013. Controversially, it has a Chinese investment of $500 million behind it, but they have brought technology into this port as well as exploited the deep water potential, and it handles these ultra-large container vessels of 20,000 TEUs, which India at the moment can't really handle. Hambantota is coming up, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about that. But China's presence in this country has led to geopolitical competition, and we've had India's response recently. You've had India doing two things, really. There's the Sagamala initiative, which India is building its own port capacity, and also it's planned to invest the Adani Group in the West Terminal in Colombo. Now, my very last point on Sri Lanka is that really for Sri Lanka to become an emerging hub in this Indian Ocean, the country should take a very commercial approach to port development and maintain strict neutrality in its foreign policy, which Singapore is, for instance, very famous for, and also begin to embrace a coherent FTA strategy, which is very important if Colombo is going to go forward. In conclusion, I really want to just talk about the need for a national, global, and industry level strategy to ensure a sustainable recovery in global maritime trade. At the global level, we need quiet diplomacy and cooperation to address trade tensions, protectionism, maritime crime, and other risks. We also need a lot of coordination to handle these industry-specific issues, such as better safety and security at sea, particularly deal with pandemic among seafarers, re-looking at the IMO regulations on environment and other areas, and enforcement of law of the sea, which has been variable because of country capacity and also perhaps not such good international coordination. At the national level, countries obviously should keep their ports open, invest in port modernization, upgrading customs and trade facilitation, and better linking into global maritime shipping systems. At the industry level, essentially, we need much more resilient business models for maritime transport and shipping lines. We need to debt restructure the big lines, and we have to ensure proper health services for seafarers. So in conclusion, essentially, the oceans have been the lifeblood of the global economy, really over the last 50 years. And so, while the pandemic has altered this outlook, we think recovery is probably happening, but with many risks going forward. Small states are present in this trade and have significant potential, but we need to ensure that small states keep a very coherent open economy strategy with a very neutral foreign economic policy. And we need a coordinated approach if we want this sector to proceed in the future. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Vignaraja. It's really, I think you broadened the scope of the discussion. So we really appreciate that. I would now like to call on Dr. David Brewster from Australian National University. David is also we tried to bring him in last year. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it didn't work out. So David, we still look forward to seeing you here in Singapore, and you follow the Indian Ocean geopolitical developments quite closely. So it'll be a nice compliment to Dr. Vignaraja's focus on economics. So the web space is yours now. We can't say floor to you.
Thank you very much, Raja. Yes, I'd certainly love to be there with you in Singapore. Unfortunately, with COVID, Australia's history as a convict settlement has reasserted itself. So they've locked us up inside our borders, and we can't get out at the moment. So I'd like to begin by commenting on what a fine book this is, and it's really incredibly timely, and I think it will soon be seen as a real reference guide to many of the issues that Sri Lanka is currently facing. I'll begin by making some a little bit random remarks about the subject that Admiral Columbagi quite rightly spoke about at the beginning of this session, in talking about how strategic competition in the Indian Ocean is increasingly causing this strategic dilemma for small and island states. And I think it's the small and island states in the region are really the countries that are going to suffer most from this growing strategic competition, much more than the larger countries. So I'll just make a few observations about what are the options of island states in responding to strategic competition among the major powers. One is, and I think this is common to many, if not most countries in the region, is having to make quite a clear distinction between their economic and security interests. And that reflects the strong economic ties that many or most countries in the region have with China, and security ties with other countries. Now, I think this certainly can be done, but it comes with risks. And obviously Australia has faced those risks in recent months under a sort of a fairly concerted campaign of economic coercion from China. Australia will withstand that coercion, but certainly smaller or less wealthy countries may find it difficult to withstand that sort of coercion. But nevertheless, I think the distinction needs to be drawn between economic and security interests, and I think most countries are able to sort of make that distinction. Another option for small countries and small island states is to really rely heavily on multilateral structures to protect themselves. And certainly this helps provide countries with a collective response to external coercion, and in some cases it can be quite successful. And I would name, for example, Seychelles as being a great country that's been able to rely on various multilateral structures to protect and advance its interests. But this approach also has its limitations, and I would specifically say for countries in South Asia, such as Sri Lanka, the multilateral structures available to it are fairly weak. The regional organisations SARC and BIMSTEC are weak organisations, and I don't think would be of significant assistance in helping smaller countries. Another option open to small states is to declare themselves non-aligned or neutral. And certainly in the Cold War, we saw many small states calling themselves non-aligned, as this provided them with a sort of an ideology and a group of other states that could provide mutual support in resisting the influence or coercion that they might have been experiencing from major powers. I wonder to what extent that has meaning in the post-Cold War years, particularly where there's no longer any meaningful non-aligned movement within the international system, and one wonders what non-alignment means in terms of ideology. And similarly with neutrality, I mean, when we talk about declaring oneself neutral, I think many of us would think of a country like Switzerland during the Second World War, when it sheltered behind its mountain stronghold and was able to withstand threats of invasion. I wonder to what extent countries who want to use these terms nowadays, whether they really have to invest new meaning in these terms and new practical aspects to what it means to be called neutral or non-aligned in the current contest between major powers. Let me just, I'll say a few comments on what I personally see as Sri Lanka's approach to dealing with this contest between the major powers. And I think Sri Lanka's approach, in my view, is really an evolving one in terms of trying to navigate that very difficult road between expectations coming from China and India, and possibly to a lesser extent the United States. Certainly the new government is trying to make this distinction between economic and security interests, and it's pursuing much needed investment from China. And certainly in some ways that makes a lot of sense. And I think efforts by the current government, including Admiral Columbagi, to reassure India that Sri Lanka wouldn't become a strategic security threat for India, I think is laudable and important. But in my view, Sri Lanka will ultimately be forced to go beyond these important rhetorical positions and define a new strategy for itself, however it wants to call it, in terms of navigating this path. Let me comment about a couple of points that I took from this great book, which I think are quite encouraging for Sri Lanka. First, I think Sri Lanka thinks big. Sri Lanka has big ambitions, both in commercial and ideational terms, and it's long sought to be really a thought leader in the Indian Ocean, including, for example, the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace initiative in the 1970s, and in more recent initiatives in trying to organise the region. And just as importantly, its commercial aspirations are just as big. including, for example, seeking to emulate Singapore's financial success as a great trading hub. And I think this thinking big, I think, is encouraging in terms of perhaps being able to navigate its way through the problems that we see in the region. But another important point, I think, is that Sri Lanka's great aspirations are also really strongly tempered by pragmatism. As an island state in a dangerous world, Sri Lanka has had to learn how to navigate the obstacles it faces in a very pragmatic way. And I was very interested to see in Professor Kerawalla's chapter on the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace proposal, how, although the proposal originated from Sri Lanka in the early 1970s, its approach was really transformed in the second half of the 1970s, not too many years later, as the regional environment changed. And it became clear that the original vision for a zone of peace would really not realistically be met. So when the Sri Lankan government saw its environment changing, saw the reality changing in front of it, it realised that it needed to, while perhaps paying a bit of lip service to the proposal, it realised that it had become really idealistic and unrealistic, and pursued more pragmatic policies in terms of addressing the region. And I think this point is really very important. Important to have big ideas, big ambitions, but it's also important to pragmatically address the strategic environment when the strategic environment changes. And I'll just finish my comments by applying those lessons or those observations about Sri Lanka's strengths in this regard in another way. And I mentioned that one of Sri Lanka's big aspirations is to pursue Singapore's commercial success as a trading hub. I wonder whether, in thinking about this idea of positioning, how it positions itself between these competing great powers, India and China in particular, we should be looking much more closely at Singapore's strategic approach to its region over the last 50 years, which I think has been an extraordinarily successful approach. It certainly hasn't tried to declare, itself non-aligned and hide away from these pressures. Rather, it's been very actively involved in helping to manage its regional security environment. It's been very pragmatic in terms of working with the United States, but also trading with China, and I think it's had a particular formula which has certainly worked for Singapore, and I think there may be many lessons for countries like Sri Lanka and other smaller island states in finding a way through this very difficult obstacles and path that it faces in the current strategic environment. So I'll end there. Thanks very much, Roger.
Thank you, David, for that. I think you went into the many complex security-related questions that have come. So, and now move on to John Bradford from ISAS. Your comments. You can speak up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I was going to ask if the microphone's working, but I can hear the feedback. I thought I'd start by just stating the biases and the research space that I bring to this question about what smaller states have as a role in the emerging maritime order. So first of all, my bias. By nationality, I'm American, and I spent more than 20 years in the US Navy. So to me, almost everything's small. And then second, my research focus is on regional maritime cooperation, especially cooperation to improve security which I see as the underpinnings of economic and geopolitical success. And so in that way, I think that the comments that I'm going to deliver are going to see a bit more tactical level than the geopolitical and major economic questions that the previous panelists touched on. So the first question I had when thinking about this topic is, what is a small state? And I know there's the definition that shows it's countries of less than 1.5 million, but this is a book about Sri Lanka, so I assume that was not the perspective we were taking. And so as I sort of looked at countries in the region, the relative size of their GDPs, their navies, their populations, something kind of came to me. And I said, so if for the purpose of this discussion, Sri Lanka is a small state, it's the 56th largest country in the world based on one of the lists I looked at. There's a level sort of above that, which is generally spoken to in the circles I run in as less than the middle powers. And I think the country that sort of straddles, and sometimes you see it on the middle powers list and sometimes you don't, is Malaysia, with a population of 32 million. So I said, okay, for the sake of this conversation, what if we said, if you're not one of the 45 biggest countries in the world, you're a small state. So that's Malaysia and below. Now, as a regional maritime guy, I take a look at the major trade routes, and the main trade route is from Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea to the Middle East. Lots of branches, lots of stops along the way, but that is the main trade route. So what was kind of interesting that I never thought about before, and maybe I'm wasting your time as it should be obvious, but from Northeast Asia, all of the states that these trade lines pass by would be considered middle or large powers, with the exception of Taiwan. Even Taiwan, arguably with the size of its economy and its military strength, would also maybe be a middle power. And it's when you arrive in the southern part of the South China Sea, you're nestled between tiny Brunei, tiny Singapore, giant Indonesia, you go through a transition zone. And then when you go out the other side, while you have very large powers, or India, Pakistan, a middle power, the trade route really passes by a large number of smaller powers. So to me, when I think about Indo-Pacific maritime security, maybe I need to be thinking about how the Indian Ocean is really a littoral of great powers, but the trade routes go past smaller powers. So I kind of brought that to this question, and then thought, if I'm going to think about the roles of smaller states, maybe the most interesting thing for this panel is to think about these states. And to reflect on and everything I had to say after that, I've rewritten listening to the previous speakers, which is great. That's how this should work. So one question is, in this emerging maritime order, how do these smaller states maintain their autonomy and strengthen the rule-based order? And I would have a couple suggestions. So first of all, I don't think any of these are earth-shattering, but the first of these would be to come together to cooperate. So again, I have the bias of coming to this from experience in the Navy. So I looked at the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium as a consultative body involved in this geographic space. And I noticed that it has 24 members. And if I look at them purely by population, the median state is Malaysia. And so the so-called smaller powers make up 50% of IONS. So a coordinated space there can bring a lot of power to the discussions and the consultations and the different decisions being made by IONS. I think even when these states can't cooperate together or choose not to, individual leadership is key. And this is a great example, as mentioned earlier. But the leadership that Sri Lanka brings with the Gaul dialogue, this is one of the most important conventions and meetings of maritime thinkers in the entire Indo-Pacific. And it doesn't happen in Delhi or Tokyo or Singapore, it happens in Sri Lanka. So I think that's another space where these smaller states can play a stronger role. And in fact, sometimes even have the advantage. The advantage of being a smaller state is that you have convening power that has a bit more neutrality. When the United States decides to call together an international sea power symposium, it carries a certain weight and a certain bias, whereas a smaller state can often have more flexibility in those as a convening power. So if the number one concern I thought about was autonomy, how to maintain autonomy and strengthen the rules-based order, the second thing I thought about is that these states really have disproportionately outsized responsibilities. It was pointed out that Sri Lanka's EEZ is 23 times the size of its land area. This is common in a lot of small states with maritime that are littoral. Another commonality, which is often the case in the smaller states, not always, is that they have relatively low maritime capacity. And this may be in terms of port capacity, but in my sense, I really mean it in terms of the capacity to properly manage their maritime space. This would be not just security, but also environmental pollution controls, et cetera. And so I think that these states, again, this is going to go back to, please pardon me for the biases that I bring from the beginning. But once again, smaller states often don't take full advantage of their leadership potential. I think that we're going to see increasing discussions between middle and great powers about how they can coordinate capacity building to tackle this space. We're seeing this in the Quad. We're seeing this among US and Japan. We're seeing it increasingly between India and many of its partners. And my experience is that when cooperation, cooperative capacity building by middle and great powers towards smaller states works well, it is almost always when that coordination takes place in the host nation's capital. When the United States and Japan, the example I know the most, meet in Hawaii or Tokyo to talk about Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia, it just doesn't work. There's many reasons why it just doesn't work well. The best examples, again, to use that place, US-Japan alliance, where they've been able to coordinate the best in maritime capacity building, has been in Hanoi and in Manoa. And it's been the strength of leaders, of individuals on the ground. But unfortunately, too often, the leader is the very Genki Japanese person or the very loud cowboy American, as opposed to the local diplomat or the local recipient. And I mean, there's various reasons for this, but if we can create a stronger balance, the outcomes will be better. So I think that's another place where the smaller states can play a better role, is voicing their priorities, not so much in the FDI, where they do a pretty good job in sort of some of these smaller capacities, and providing leadership over the great powers, because if they're capital, they can provide that. They can provide that weight. And I think going back to what I mentioned earlier, we're going to see increasing amounts of capacity building cooperation and pressures from the larger powers. I think the Quad is going to be doing that even more. And if there's a concern that the Quad is going to be an interventionist body or a body which disrupts the sovereignty of smaller states, then the number one way to stand up to that is to start coordinating now and to start creating the voices and being the force that in their country, they are the focal point that the Quad must go through. So with that, I'll stop. I think I have 1 or 2 extra minutes, but I'll give it back to the chair because I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, John. That was great. Before I proceed further, I just wanted to ask our audience on Zoom, please send in your questions in writing. I mean, don't wait till the end of the panel session. We're going to come to a close shortly. So please send in your questions. My colleagues will channel them to me. So look forward to receiving all your questions. And also to the audience here, physically present, please think through your questions. In about 5-7 minutes, we'll start coming to the floor to take your questions. But before I go to Chulani, I just wanted to respond to the question of size. Size is a relative thing. Sri Lanka, a lot of South Asian countries say they're small because you have India, which is so big. So it's really most of the time in comparison to India when they say small, like Pakistan is the 5th or 6th largest country in the world. Bangladesh has got 200 million, no, nearly 170 million people. You have Sri Lanka, as you said, is 28 million, but Sri Lanka is big if you're sitting in Maldives. So this idea, that Sri Lanka is smaller, but I think it's really that, as David said, some of the problems today that the smaller states face. I mean, in a way, Sri Lanka has become the macrocosm, if you will, where the concentration of the issues that the kind of issues we're beginning to face, that Sri Lanka presents itself. Small does not mean less influential. I mean, if you go back to the Indian Ocean debates of the 1970s, it was Sri Lanka that took the lead in initiating the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace resolution in the UN. Sri Lanka was the chair of the non-aligned movement. So I think Sri Lanka has had a fairly impressive role in shaping international opinion. And I think when we go back to even the prior period, the people there was something called the Colombo powers. I mean, people have forgotten. It was India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Burma, that talked about Asia. Before Southeast Asia talked about Asia, it was the Colombo powers, which were talking about Asia, speaking for Asia, calling for the Bandung Conference, calling for a whole range of things. So you had actually a long history of Sri Lanka's international activism. And Sri Lanka is a center of Buddhism, as one of the oldest civilizations. Again, I think has had an outsized influence in shaping regional politics. So I wouldn't, if I were a Sri Lankan, I wouldn't worry about being small. I think it's really a question of what one does today, given the dynamic situation. I mean, if you look at other countries, countries like Qatar, what, less than 1 million? Because they have the money to influence the way Qatar has become so important. For Singapore, for that matter, a small country, but by using location, intelligence, and globalization to exercise influence that is completely outsized, far beyond what you would expect the size will produce. So I think there are a combination of factors. So I'm going to ask Chulani to respond to some of the major ideas that have come, and then we'll go to the floor after.
Thank you, Prof. I think I totally agree with you. There is an academic debate about what are the parameters when you define a small country. And most of the things I think that came out in the discussion falls for the quantitative definition, where you look at the population size, etc. But there is also another group which talks about qualitative aspects, where they compare a country with another, and also where they consider how that particular country perceives itself in the international system. So I think, for instance, if you take Singapore, it is a small state when it comes to quantitative sense. But I don't think we can say the same thing if you look at it in the qualitative sense. It has a very relatively good influence in the international system. But you cannot say the same thing about Sri Lanka in international politics. So Sri Lanka, in my understanding, is a small country in qualitative sense. So having said that, I think there were very interesting points raised throughout the discussion about the strategic autonomy, how important strategic autonomy for small states. So I want to add one more aspect to that, like one of the challenges small countries face in protecting their strategic autonomy is protecting their territorial water. So I'll take Sri Lanka again as an example. Now, for over 2-3 decades now, Sri Lanka is facing a challenge due to Indian fishers' encroachment into the territorial water. So then there are questions why it has not been resolved for so long and why it is being dragged for so long. Then this affect Sri Lanka's territorial integrity, security, and economic development, and also when it questions the validity of the international law. But I think that's where the whole dynamic about small powers and great powers come into play. There is a definite asymmetric power balance between India and Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has very little room to negotiate on its term and say, like, you cannot come to our water, because you are dealing with a bigger power upon whom your economy is partly dependent, who are more powerful in terms of security and in the international system. I also want to highlight another aspect. About the climate vulnerability. I think this is something that is not that does not come into discussion when we are talking about great power rivalry or the geopolitics in the Indian Ocean. But most of the small countries in the Indo-Pacific are susceptible to climate change and the impact that comes with it. According to the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it identifies 51 small island states which are mostly affected by climate vulnerabilities. So they are particularly vulnerable to climate shocks such as trade winds, El Nino, monsoons, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and the rise of the sea levels, etc., especially because of their geography, their reliance on coastal industries, and in some cases because of their weak capability to address these issues. So, for instance, countries like Somalia and Micronesia are ranked among the most vulnerable countries. Even Sri Lanka is ranked at 121, Myanmar at 164. Mauritius, which is relatively a strong economy as island state, still ranked at 100, even Maldives at 151. So changing weather pattern lead to drought, shifting river flow levels, affecting the agriculture output and food security of these countries. And their coastal economy and coastal well-being is affected because of the climate change and the climate change factors. And the one point Dr. Columbage pointed out is the marine pollution. I think marine pollution affect sustainable fisheries and ocean resources. So, and most of these countries are also dependent on climate tourism. So I think this is a conversation we have to bring forward when we are talking not just about small states, but in general when we are talking about maritime affairs today.
I mean, strategic autonomy is not a problem of small states, whichever you define. It was India, second largest country in the world, which has popularized the term strategic autonomy over the decades. And today, Europe, which is one of the most powerful economic entities, talking about collective Europe is talking about strategic autonomy. So I think the conditions under which you seek this can vary. So again, I think size is not the issue. Therefore, you could be, given your location and the context that makes it. So I think I think I'll request all our colleagues on Zoom to send in their questions in writing as soon as you can, and keep sending them in. And meanwhile, we'll go to the floor. So if there are any questions from the floor, anyone wants to? Yeah, please, Ms. Pandey. Yeah.
Thank you, Raja. I think you talked about strategic autonomy, and of course, it's relative now. Even India wanted it. But given the sharp divergence and bipolarity we are going to witness, this is a question for John. What is the hope that small countries like Sri Lanka can actually, in this growing divergence, manage a strategic autonomy when even countries like India have actually started taking sides in this debate, and Quad is a classic example. And this isn't going away. So I think is there an inevitability of it, or is there a hope that people can manage it?
hope, David, you're there as well, so please chip in. But before I go to John, I mean, this talk about autonomy, neutrality, non-alignment, but actually, if you go back to the Cold War, the small countries, including all the developing countries, I mean, that they were quite adept at playing one against the other, right? So it is not that it also offers opportunities that you have when there are multiple suitors. If there's one BRI, one Indo-Pacific, one other guy providing connectivity, your choices in terms of what you can pick are more actually in a competitive world rather than in a single supplier dominated situation. So it is not as clear to me that the return of geopolitical competition will actually shrink options. It could also increase the leverage of the small countries vis-a-vis the big countries, because if they have something to give, they might be able to get quite a bit given the rivalry between the powers. So we'll start with you, John, and I'll also ask David if he's around there and somewhere up there. So David, feel free to chip in on this, and you too.
Yeah, Raja, I agree completely. If we look back at the Cold War examples, many nations, including small nations, were able to maintain their strategic autonomy. I think that the upcoming competition will create even more opportunities. I could be wrong. We could get to a situation where the competition becomes so great that China and the United States divvy out spheres of influence, and even basic trade and communication is limited between those. But we are a long way from that. And China and the United States as economies are a long way from that. So while it's possible, it's not going to happen tomorrow, and it's not a foregone conclusion. So in the meantime, exactly as Raja says, there's an opportunity to play one off the other. But also, I would note that Admiral Secretary Kulumbagi said that there was no desire to play one off each other. It is also possible to maintain a perfectly autonomous bilateral relationship with both. I was using an example at the beginning of this talk, but I was just talking with someone casually about, the US has a lot of concerns about BRI Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, port facilities, et cetera. Well, in 2016, I was still in the US Navy, and I went to Sri Lanka aboard the US 7th Fleet's flagship, USS Blue Ridge. First time US Navy ships had returned after some time. And the pier we used was a commercial built pier, which was in downtown Colombo, that was built by the Chinese. So this isn't a matter of anyone playing off anyone. It's the US wants to bring its Navy here and cooperate. China wants to bring its money here and build this pier. Both are public goods available to the smaller power. So, I think I'll leave it at that to hear others. I don't want to say it's not a concern. It absolutely is a concern. But I think smart countries, and I think Sri Lanka is definitely on that list, have plenty of options available.
Thanks, Roger. I'll say a few words on that.
Raja to join as well. I mean, after David finishes, he could come in to respond to this question. David, yeah.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree that strategic competition between major powers will multiply options for smaller states in terms of playing them off against each other. And smaller states tend to have much greater agency than many people assume, and some small states can, have been particularly adept at playing off the big powers and getting significant benefits. And I mentioned one before. Seychelles, I think, is a great example. Historically, during the Cold War, it was aligned with the Soviet Union, but it also had a US communications base on it, and was able to really play them off against each other for its own benefit. And that's a good example. But I think probably fair to say that the majority of small states suffer significantly from major power competition, and that's because major powers reach in to the domestic politics of the states to try and find leaders that side with them and influence the domestic politics. And that's the great fear. That happened to a huge extent during the Cold War, even to the extent of proxy civil conflicts occurring within many states, as they've each side were the Soviet Union and the United States essentially caused civil conflicts. We should expect that to occur increasingly in coming days. And so I don't think we should see strategic competition as some sort of bonanza for small states that can gain benefits. I think on balance, it's a much more of a danger for small states in terms of fending off attempts to influence their domestic realms. And that's why small states need to be very agile and nimble in finding a way through a path through these obstacles so that they don't, or maybe a better way is that they give each side each of the major powers sufficient stakes in the continued independence of that small state not to interfere too much. And I think that's the great secret. And as I said, I think Singapore has been an extraordinary example of that over the last 50 years or so. And it's a very difficult path. And I think many states will not find that path, and they will succumb to this competition within their domestic realms. Only a few will find this path through. Thanks.
Dr. Vignaraja, are you there?
Yes, I am. Just interesting point, and I want to draw on the Sri Lankan case as well. Generically, this idea of Singapore and some of the others who have maintained strict neutrality, part of this is linked to, we may say, a small economy, but a strong economy, right? That's very important. If you have economic strength, you have many more options, right? That's number one. Then this economic strength also comes from being in a very solid regional architecture, right? So Singapore is part of ASEAN, right? Which is a 500 million market that has a lot of synergy within it. It's also part of APEC, which provides a lot of policy ideas. So being in a strong economy with a good regional arrangement obviously matters. And then I think the success of the Singapores of this world really is also having strong policy capacity, being able to make policies very cogently and make these policy choices, be it foreign, be it defense, be it economic. Now, if you take the Sri Lankan case, our economy sadly is not strong. I mean, we have a debt overhang set of issues, which is making it very difficult. And COVID has kind of pushed it potentially to a point of difficulty. But growth this year will pick up. And our hope is that tourism and exports will come up, and that will solve the short-term balance of payments crisis. In regional arrangements, we are unlucky. The SARC issue has been there, which is problematic. And policy capacity has been a bit variable. So I think there's part of your answer is the economics of this.
Thank you, Dr. Before, would you want to answer this, Chulani, some of the issues?
No, Prof. I think Dr. Vignaraja covered the Sri Lankan situation well. I agree that I think it's tempting to compare Sri Lanka and Singapore all the time. This has been in discussion for a longer period, even in Sri Lanka. But as he said, it depends on your circumstances, how strong you are economically, politically, and in what kind of an environment you are.
Thank you. I have one question from Zoom side, but I saw a hand at the back. Yes, please. Just why don't you stand up, introduce yourself.
I'm I'm Ramita. I'm a research analyst at ISAS. And my question is regarding the rising India-China rivalry. And given this and the existence of different maritime public goods, what is the realistic choice that small island states have? Now, during the talk, you mentioned about strategic autonomy and also non-alignment. But I wonder if in this particular case, hedging would be something that would benefit small countries in ensuring maritime governance.
In fact, you heard Admiral Columbage used all those phrases and that he settled on strategic autonomy rather than hedging, aligning, bandwagoning, balancing to actually saying. So, I mean, so I think, but it's interesting question. You want to start?
Yeah. So I think if you look at Sri Lanka's foreign policy over the years, strategic hedging has been the policy. Sri Lanka works with all the countries depending on its own interest. When it comes to economy, it has ties with China, which is very stronger. But when it comes to security, I think the strongest ties are with India. So small states so far has used strategic hedging as a very successful policy. So, but then the question will be like going forward, how whether this will be good enough to face the competition between India, China, and I think United States is also coming into play. Yeah.
John, you would want to comment on how should other small states here deal with India, China?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of that. There's plenty of room for hedging and maintaining independent space. I would also state that it is possible to align oneself and still maintain space. I brought this bias as an American, but I spent more than 15 years in Japan. America and Japan are stalwart allies, but Japan certainly maintains its autonomy, as does Australia, as does the United Kingdom. So you could find it in your best interest to pick a side and still maintain your autonomy. Every state needs to make its own choices based on its particular interests. And we're talking about a lot of diversity of states in this conversation.
Yeah, David, after that, I'll go to Dr.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few words about this idea of strategic autonomy. The reality is that perhaps with one or two exceptions, countries in this world, no state in the world has complete strategic autonomy. Every state is influenced or subject to influences and pressures to either a smaller degree or a very, very large degree. And the degree to which states, so strategic autonomy is not an absolute concept. It's even a huge country like India does not have full strategic autonomy. It might aspire to it, but it doesn't have it. And smaller countries generally will have to accept impositions on their autonomy accordingly. Very small states have very little autonomy. They'll just try and maintain the smallest degree of autonomy. So we shouldn't get hung up on that. Obviously, states will try to maximize whatever space they can get, but they will have to accept that they have only limited degree to move, whatever is according to their geographic situation, economic situation, etc. And so they would seek to maximize autonomy, but they will not have full strategic autonomy. And I think that's an important point to make.
Thank you. Dr. Vignaraj, I mean, I think you mentioned, how Sri Lanka should maintain strict neutrality, separate its, politics and economics. And this government today in Sri Lanka talked about balanced foreign policy. But we've seen it, it's quite clearly, is that really possible? I mean, one can ask the question of really a balanced policy between India and China, or is it
so
rather than practical?
So I think so. You've got a very good point. We started with this non-aligned approach, and I think we did it fairly well. And then over time, there was the shift to China, and then we're trying to tilt it back in some way to this strategic neutrality. And the difficulties we haven't really properly evaluated, I feel, the comparative advantages of what each of the powers can give us and how do we take our space within that. So for instance, China is very good at giving you infrastructure, but if they give you a power plant, you better know how to operate it properly. So it's a matter of us kind of breaking this out. India is very good at giving vaccines, which have some confidence, the AstraZeneca one, for instance, which other people question, but I don't think we question it in Sri Lanka. So we need to use the ability to unpick these things. That requires sophistication. And I think that's what, the Singapores and the Malaysias and others have done well. And I think we have to develop that deep sophistication in foreign diplomatic, military, and other strategy. And that requires heavy investment in our own skills and policy capacities. That's my own view. We have to start now.
Thank you. There is one question from the Zoom side. It says, look, is the control of SLOCs, or the sea lines of communication, and the search for island facilities and bases, I mean, that was the context in which, in the colonial period and later in the Cold War, the location on SLOCs gives the value and that makes them attractive. And, it's both an attraction and a curse. And that's what drives the competition. So, but the question here is this really return to neocolonialism? That is the question. Or do we've also argued, actually the countries might have agency today in a way that they did not have in the colonial period. So is it neocolonialism, or is it actually the small states have agency to make choices of their own?
Well, I think neocolonialism is a loaded term, and I don't say that to disparage it. I just mean it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Are we talking the same neocolonialism that was talked about in the 70s and 80s? Or if it's something new, is it neocolonialism? I'm not really sure. I think it goes back to the same point that no state has full strategic autonomy. I think that was Dr. Brewster had a good point there. Smaller states are going to have less. Big powers are going to be more invested in the outcomes in states which are along SLOCs than ones that are not. And so certainly large powers are going to want to intervene. That's an unfortunate truth depending on where you sit. But I think if we go back to our previous conversation, there's still room to push back.
David?
Yeah, look, I think agree with John. I don't know whether the term neocolonialism, whatever that means, is necessarily the best lens to understand what's going on. It's really simply just power, and large powers trying to use their power to influence or impose upon small countries to get what they want. And some small countries will be good at playing off their geographic location or other attributes to their benefit. And Djibouti is a great example. It's turned its geographic location into an industry of selling off bases or leasing out bases for financial benefit. Good on it. Other countries suffer much more from that same contest because they're, for whatever domestic weaknesses or other factors, they're unable to, to mobilise their benefits to their advantage. I don't know whether neocolonialism is a good or way of explaining it, but it's really just a matter of power and agency, I think, in my view.
Ganesh, you want to come in on this?
Yes, just very briefly. We've talked a lot in the Sri Lankan case about location, but we probably haven't realized the full benefit of that potential. And the argument that, we are now building the Colombo port city, the different port-led strategy, that may be one route, but we need to also complement that with economic reforms and building a strong economy and trying to get a political consensus of the future of the country. I think these are important things. Thank you so much.
There was another question from Zoom essentially saying that why are we talking about strategic autonomy when climate change is a much bigger issue? I think the problem here, look, even the most seemingly, kind of universal nature of an issue does not take away politics from it. I mean that climate change is a US-China issue, whether it plays positively or negatively. I mean, how to divide the costs of changing the structure of the economy and the energy consumption. It becomes a political question. The question of who gets to pay for it between developed and developing countries, it becomes a political issue. So I think politics can't be taken away. I mean, but it exists. But there's also the question that the collective threat that the climate change poses is a real problem. And I think that problem is acute in the case of all coastal communities, all island states, small states, big or small. I mean that you have sea levels rising. What it does is a big issue. So I think the question is, while politics is there a way of separating some of these? I mean, that look, while geopolitics continues at one level, can countries collaborate to do at least some public good or some common interest? For example, can the Bay of Bengal states work together to remove the dead zones? Can we work together to do something? I mean, it won't solve the entire problem. So is there a way of separating the geopolitical from the climate change type of, from the urgent issues that the smaller the country, the greater the threat of survival in the current context? So maybe, Sri Shuman, I'll leave it to you how to address this. Maybe we'll start with you, Chulani.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting point because, as I mentioned in my opening remarks also, climate change is one of the key issues for these small countries. And of course, it's a issue for everyone. So rather than talking about multiple differences and conflicting factors, this is something that is affecting every human being, whether you are coming from politically strong or politically weak country or big or small. So this gives us an opportunity to think together and make collective action. So in general, we say that rather than trying to solve contradictory issues, it's important to start with issues that are less contradictory. So collective action towards climate change, I think, will give this opening point for the countries to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific region.
Ganesh, I mean, I think climate change is also an economic issue. You mentioned about separating politics and economics. I mean,
yes,
thoughts on how to deal with it?
Yes. So just as a very quick answer to your point, climate change has many dimensions. Some are amenable to collective action easily on the public goods front that you mentioned. And one very common threat facing Indian Ocean states is this plastic pollution. I mean, there's a very large iceberg of plastic stuff rolling around even the Indian Ocean, which I think all the countries can collaborate very easily and try to get rid of it. But say the global warming issue may be more divisive because trying to go towards low carbon growth is quite costly. In Sri Lanka, for instance, it means moving away from our coal-fired power plant, which is potentially climate damaging, to renewables, which can be quite an expensive transition. So I think there are some areas of climate change which are very much in the public good area, and some areas which are more divisive, such as this shift to low carbon growth. But both are obviously necessary. That's my short answer. Thank you.
David, you wanted to come in? Are you there, David?
Yes. Thanks, Raja. Look, I think sometimes countries are able to address climate change without geopolitics becoming too much involved, and perhaps the Paris Treaty is an example of that. But otherwise, I think geopolitics is always there, and countries will operate to address even huge global issues like climate change within the context of geopolitics. That may not be the perfect answer, or the perfect solution, but it's the reality. And to the extent that some countries might see benefits in addressing climate change within the geopolitical context as a sort of a competitive measure, just as they hand out vaccines to smaller states as part of a geopolitical competition, it may not necessarily be bad because it's sort of a motivator as a way of demonstrating public good that may not otherwise be there if there was no geopolitics in the strategic environment.
John, I mean, you saw the Biden administration is actually made it very clear they want to engage China on climate change and related issues. But at the same time, they're saying that that's separate from the challenges that China poses today in the maritime domain. In fact, last few days, we've seen affirming a posture of deterrence, a posture of remobilizing alliances and partnerships. So how will this play out? I mean, the climate change issue and the geopolitical side.
Yeah, I think that the struggle that the Biden administration will find itself in reflects a much broader problem with the way we address these issues. I think the Biden administration recognizes and believes that climate change is a huge issue, but it doesn't know how to deal with that in absence or in isolation from these other issues. And I think that's because I think that's the exact same reason, to go back to the original question, why are we talking about geopolitics? And I think the reason is because the topic is emerging maritime affairs. We have thousands of years of history that we're trained to study about how changes in economic balances and military power change maritime affairs. So we're looking at that, but we don't have that same historical data or that empirical studies of how when humans irreversibly change their climate, how do we deal with that? And so I think that's actually part of the problem. I think we need a lot more dialogue between the scientists and the social scientists to understand how this is really going to play out so we can start to really get at it. I think we're still stuck in our own policy or academic silos.
Yeah, there was one more question from the audience in terms of the security considerations of the smaller states vis-a-vis great powers. But I want to tie it to the question of geography, that sometimes we tend to think of things symmetrically, that actually even in the Cold War, US and China, so US and Russia, Soviet Union, we talked about. But the geography of the competition, how it affected different countries on the Soviet periphery was different from how it affected distant countries. The kind of things America had to do to develop forward presence, to create bases around Soviet Union. So I think, like in the case of India, China, it's one thing to say, look, India and China, but the fact is, India is next door to Sri Lanka, just across the Park Strait. So that creates a messy complication. So it's not just, and on the economic side, if you look, India is much weaker than China, and India can't offer the kind of resources that China offers. So symmetry might sound, easy to talk about, but the real world, there is no symmetry. That condition varies from place to place. Like in Nepal, which is sandwiched between the two countries, there's one kind of a problem. Sri Lanka is still far from China, or how that plays out in Mauritius or Seychelles can be very different. So how do you see this issue? I mean, how do countries manage, or for example, how does Sri Lanka manage the messy geography that it has got with India sitting on top, at least on the map, looming large?
I think you are correct, Prof. Geography plays a very important role in Sri Lanka's foreign policy. So, because India is geographically closer to Sri Lanka, it brings one set of opportunities and one set of challenges. Because India is closer, it has become one of the major trading partners. As Dr. Ganesh mentioned, India is Sri Lanka's major partner in its maritime trade, maritime transit trade. But because we also share a considerable cultural, historical links because of this geographical proximity, which brings a set of challenges. There's a history where Indian kings have invaded Sri Lanka, and then numerous events where India involved in Sri Lankan domestic politics, and then there is a cultural connection between Indian and Sri Lankan community. So these things add to the complexity, making the foreign policy, like a bilateral policy, quite complicated. On the other hand, China, as you said, is not very close to Sri Lanka. It's not its immediate neighborhood. So it does not share the same challenges with China. So that makes the relationship much more easier. So I think if you compare what the other states in South Asia is going through in terms of China-India competition, and the states in East and Southeast Asia going through in terms of China, it's somewhat similar. When you have a very strong, powerful neighbor, you have your own security concerns and considerations, which play in terms of your relationship at different levels. So I think that's where the geography is important.
Ganesh, you want to come in? I mean, does geography and distance play, what kind of role will it play on the?
Yes, so you raised a very important point. I mean, if we look at India in the context of Sri Lanka, on the economic side, the relationship is well below potential, just in terms of the value of trade and also other things. But what India really can offer Sri Lanka, which is unique to China, is this health diplomacy, I feel. I mentioned the vaccine earlier, and the AstraZeneca, India came and gave us 500,000 doses as a gift. We are trying to buy another 10 million. So AstraZeneca will be our vaccine of choice. The Sinoprom may come, but people are suspicious, and I think there will be a backlash given the clinical trial issue. The health thing makes a lot of sense because India gave us, and there was some controversy, a vast fleet of ambulances because our public health system, was very good, but we couldn't take people to hospital properly. And India gave us a gift, a aid, which has been good. So India has that advantage. The other thing India can offer us to build a trade relationship is really something I've been advocating, which is everything but arms access to the market, particularly the southern states, which India has given Bangladesh. So I think India has some tools in its box that's available. And of course, some defense cover. They have built some of our offshore patrol boats, and they've done a lot of training for our people. China, of course, has the cash and the infrastructure projects, but we have good and bad projects. And being entangled with China exposes us to other risks. So I think it really does come back to this policy capability thing and being able to understand what each power can give us. And that requires a very high degree of human capital and planning capacity, which I think we have to create if we really want to survive this. And I kind of agree with David that, everybody is sort of caught up in this difficult area of absolute advantage in some sense, in a defense and other sense, but you can manipulate a little bit if you're smart. And I think that's the point John was making. And I think we must try, otherwise, we will be up, in a difficult position. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll come to David and John. There is Chinese, have an interesting saying that, look, you align with the far against the near. Go back to the warring states, that you balance against your neighbor overweening power by aligning with a distant power whose potential to threaten you is less. So that's one principle, align with the far against the near. But on the other hand, the same Chinese also tell us, the next door neighbor is more important than a distant relative. That is, you can't go beyond a point going against your own neighbor. So both of course, all principles have a counter principle. So looking at the balancing game, whether it's on the economic side or on the strategic side, but how do these principles play out? Do you reach out to the distant power to balance the neighbor, or do you kind of accept the argument like what the Chinese say in Asia, for example? Look, Uncle Sam is far away. He can't really save you. But you need to build a good relationship with China. But in the Indian Ocean, they offer a balancing role. China offers a very interesting balancing role. So, David.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I think your point about the importance of proximity is incredibly important, and I think a great example of that is comparing Sri Lanka with Mauritius. Now, Mauritius is heavily embedded within the Indian security structure so that India is in effect the security guarantor of Mauritius. And I think that works well for Mauritius. Mauritius is very comfortable with that arrangement. It benefits from it. But Mauritius is an awful long way away from India. So that means that the fears of domination that come with proximity are not, so strong in the case of Mauritius. Obviously, Sri Lanka is very close to India. And part of that proximity is ethnic interlinking, if you like, between the two countries, which brings its own issues. And obviously, there are natural fears from Sri Lanka about being dominated by India. On the other hand, Sri Lanka is not going anywhere. It's always going to be there next to India. It's not sailing away over the horizon. And so I think it would be a major error for Sri Lanka to disregard the concerns, whether founded or not, of its huge neighbour. And so that it always, I think, must go the extra mile and then an extra mile in terms of reassuring India that it will never become a security threat to India. It has failed to do that sufficiently, adequately on one or two occasions in Sri Lanka's history, and that has been to Sri Lanka's great detriment, I think. And so I think the lessons are there that in order to, I suppose it's a little bit paradoxical, in order to maximise Sri Lanka's level of autonomy, it also has to minimise it in a way in terms of absolutely emphasising over and over again to its huge neighbour that it will never become a threat to India.
So I'll just come to you. Last John, I just want to add a point to this, which is our former National Security Advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon, who was also High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, once said, Sri Lanka is an aircraft carrier. It can be an aircraft carrier for China, or it can be an aircraft carrier for India. So how do you, location of Sri Lanka in a maritime sense, how does it play out between India and China?
Well, I mean, again, I believe that there's a lot of space for states to, not just Sri Lanka, but all the Indian Ocean states, to not pick a side for quite some time. But if you assume that the competition between the United States and China is going to look more like the Cold War, and both powers are going to demand decisions and intervene in the domestic affairs of those that don't. I mean, if you assume that, then I think the best analogy to look at is the Caribbean. And if you look at the Caribbean during the Cold War, there were states that chose to allow themselves to become US satellites. There was Cuba, which did the exact opposite and withstood American attack. And then there was a whole bunch of countries that got battered between the two. So does geography matter? Absolutely. But is it predetermined of anything? I don't think so. I think there's still choices out there.
Thank you. I think that was probably, we just have one last question from anyone? So.
Discussions on strategic autonomy, but given that we made Indo-Pacific one in the eyes of the Quad, take yourself back to the 19th century when the Monroe Doctrine comes in with the US and Europe. And now we have a very clear view of the South China Sea as a backyard for China. Australians consider South Pacific as their backyard. What is stopping something like that not happening in the Indian Ocean? A mini Monroe Doctrine.
For whom?
For the Indian Ocean states by India or the Quad, saying this is our backyard.
Good question. I mean, does anybody want to answer that? Maybe we'll go from the other round. I'll give you the last word. Ganesh, you want to come in on that? I mean, can there be an exclusive sphere of influence against the world's second largest economy, which is China?
So I mean, it's a really $1 million question, and I don't think we've got a good answer to that. So on the defense side, Sri Lanka has taken military assistance from both India and China in different ways. But I think, and we've sort of tried desperately in the Hambantota case to assure India that the Chinese naval presence is not there and it will never come, and so on. But I think ultimately we have to tread very, very carefully with this Chinese presence in Sri Lanka, and I think the only way around it is by trying to have a very strict policy. I would even go so far as saying that Sri Lanka might want to sign a trilateral defense agreement with India and the Maldives as an additional step towards reassuring India. We had some problems with transit agreements with the United States and so on, but I think with India this would be an important step. So I think we need to bring some more regional rules-based issues into this, and that might help into such a structure, and also embed ourselves more into an Asian security structure, which is still evolving, of course. And you're the expert on that, but I think these are very important steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Ganesh. David?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I think that the contrary to the suggestion that the Indian Ocean would be dominated by any one power, the future of the Indian Ocean is a multipolar one. It's not going to be dominated by the United States or India or China alone. It's going to be very much a balancing act, not only between those three very big powers, but also a whole multitude of important middle powers, whether that be Indonesia, Australia, Bangladesh, South Africa, or even Sri Lanka. I think in some ways could be considered a aspirational middle power, and it's going to involve shifting coalitions and alliances over particular issues. But it's certainly, I don't think there's any meaningful prospect that it's going to be dominated by any single power in coming years.
John?
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm not sure the Monroe Doctrine is a great historical example, because when the Monroe Doctrine was first announced, the vast majority of the Western Hemisphere was a formal colony of European powers. So the idea that the United States was keeping the Europeans out when the Europeans was resident is just very different from the way the world works today. But if we are going to use that example, I'll say that even in that example, and even with the duration of the doctrine, and even with the strength of the United States, the Western Hemisphere remained multipolar. Hence why even up into the 1980s, the United States continued to fight wars in the Western Hemisphere.
Chulani, the last word for you. I think we're almost out of time. So.
Yes, I think I also agree. I don't think Indian Ocean will be unipolar region, because the world will not be a unipolar region. It's the signs are that the world is going to be a multipolar system. I think that will apply to Indian Ocean region as well. So which will result in having multiple strategies. We already do have multiple strategies, whether it's Quad or BRI. So the other countries will have multiple options to choose from to realize their own interests. So the challenge or the challenge would be like how they will navigate this multiple options in a multipolar world.
Thank you. I think we're really out of time, and I just wanted to bring this to a close by saying, again, congratulating Chulani for this interesting and important book. Also thanking the High Commissioner of Sri Lanka, who's spent time with us, and Admiral Colombage from Colombo, that really to participate and make this discussion enriching. My special thanks to the panelists, John, David, and Ganesh, for making this such an interesting discussion on the kind of issues that have been raised by this book. So I would really want to, I'm sure all of you enjoyed this discussion, and all of you agree with me that discussion has raised a number of issues. So please join me in thanking our panelists and the editor of this Final word that it's just a promise that the Institute of South Asian Studies, we will continue to engage with these issues because the maritime domain, the question of small island states, the question of new balance of power, amidst the other turbulences, both on the nature of globalization that is being tested and the climate change related issues, I sense that South Asia and its waters is going to be a very important part of this global discourse. And I think ISAS is well positioned to continue to study this part of the world. And I want to thank all our participants who joined us here today, as well as our colleagues on Zoom who took to participate in this session. So thank you all. And that brings us to a close. I mean, Roshni, you want to bring us to a close? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mohan and distinguished panelists. We thank everyone here and those who have been watching via live stream, and we hope to see you at the next ISAS event. Due to COVID-19 safety measures, please do not intermingle while making your way out of the ballroom. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.